So I started 2 weeks ago in a study in the Gospel of John. I said last week, because I didn't speak last week. Justin spoke last week, 2 weeks ago, and gave an intro to the Gospel at that point, and also looked at the first 13 verses there. And in that passage, John the Apostle is introducing Jesus. And so I had as my topic for that week, who is Jesus? And we mentioned that John uses the term logos of Jesus, and that word was really a word that had a lot of meaning to people at that point, an all-encompassing meaning. And I won't go into the details of that again. To the Greeks, it meant the rational principle that governs everything. So it was this Jesus saying, okay, all this word that you use to describe, this is the overarching power, that's Jesus, okay? So he uses that word of him. So he says that Jesus is that word. And then he says a number of things about Jesus. I'm just going to go through these real quick just to refresh your memory a little bit. Jesus already was in the beginning. In other words, before anything was, Jesus already was. He was with God. He was God. If you ever wonder who is Jesus, it's stated really clear in this passage. And Jesus created all things. I'm actually going to just touch on that a little bit in a few minutes here. And we talked about Jesus being the giver of life. So we're actually going to continue on in the Gospel of John, and we're still in the introduction that he gives to the book. And really the things we're going to talk about today carry on in that same theme of who Jesus is. And if I could summarize the verses that we're going to be looking at today in the context of that, I've called it Jesus entered our world and we saw God. That's in many ways that's what John would say, and it has all kinds of application to our lives. It makes all the difference when we realize that when Jesus physically came to the earth, it was actually God coming in his Son, Jesus Christ. It makes all the difference to how we live. It makes all the difference to our relationship with him if we understand that that's who Jesus was, that's who Jesus is. So we're going to just look at a few verses today, actually John 1:14 to 18. So I'll have them up here. I'm just going to read those at this point. So, carries on from where we were, John 1:14, the Word. Again, this is the logos. He's using that Greek word continually, and like I already described. So, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me.' Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." So if I could start right off, the first thing I would talk about here is this thing of Jesus, the Logos, became flesh and blood just like us. He became flesh. He made his dwelling among us. Everything that we said the Logos is, everything that we said last week Jesus is, that's who became flesh and blood. The one through whom absolutely everything was created actually became man. So we could talk about all kinds of stuff in terms of the created order, okay? And as I think I've mentioned this before to you, but I just think of our universe. And I think of, okay, Jesus created all that. If you can just put up with me for just a little bit, because I get wowed by when I think of the universe, okay? They say that there are approximately 200 billion stars in our galaxy, the Milky Way. That's a few stars, don't you think? Now, just to try to, I try to just play a little bit with a few mathematical figures in terms of trying to help us understand this a bit more. And I don't know why I arrived at these numbers, but this is what I arrived at. First of all, if you were traveling in a jet, they travel about 500 miles an hour once they're at altitude and stuff. If you traveled at that speed of 500 miles an hour, it would take you 21 years to get to the closest star, our sun. Okay? So, you got that perspective? Now, imagine if you could be traveling in a rocket so fast that you traveled past 750 stars per second. Okay, 21 years to get to the closest one at 500 miles an hour. But imagine if you could go past 750 of them per second. 750, 750, 700. Okay, so you're going past. What was it here? 45,000 of them in a minute. Okay. It would still take you 8 years just to get past the stars in our galaxy at that rate. That's a lot of stars to get past. Now, here's something that blows my mind even more. Astronomers, scientists at the University of Nottingham in the UK, using NASA's Hubble Space Telescope info, now say that they believe there are 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. That's as of October of last year. Okay? As they continue to look and continue to explore and continue to figure this all out, they figure there are 10 times the amount of galaxies as there are stars in our universe. Does that blow your mind? And Jesus created all that. He made all that. And Jesus is everywhere present. And that's who became flesh and blood. I mean, I think of people, you see some stuff on TV at different times, and people are all enamored with meeting some celebrity, and like, oh, I got to touch him, I got to be there, Jesus, who created the universe we've just described, became flesh and blood. Now, in the Old Testament, God, Yahweh, took on human form at various points. We have a number of examples of God appearing in some way to people. The angel of the Lord, which we believe is a Christophany or an appearance of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to Abraham. The angel of the Lord also appeared to Hagar when she ran away from Sarah because she was being mistreated by Sarah. In Genesis 16. Moses and Aaron and the 70 elders, God appeared to them on the mountain. But now God didn't just appear, he actually became flesh. With all its inherent weakness, with all its frailty that a human body has, God didn't just speak, he didn't just send prophets, and I'm not minimizing that, okay? But he did more. He didn't just appear to people, he actually came himself. And John says he made his dwelling among us. The word actually is that he tented among us. It's the Greek word that would have meant, it would have reminded the people of the Old Testament where, hold on, God came in a tent before. You could use the word tabernacled if you want to use the more King James kind of word. God actually came and took up residence among us. It would have reminded them of the glory coming to the tent of meeting. The Message translation says, he moved into the neighborhood. In other words, here's God. And he's described, for all the first verses, he's described the majesty of God, the incredible thing of who Jesus was. And he was with God in the beginning, and he was God, and he created everything. He did all this, and he became flesh and blood. He became one of us. And John's just trying to paint this picture. Do you guys realize who he is, what he is, who actually came? And so we could talk about all kinds of implications, and I'm actually going to ask you for some input here in terms of implications because there's loads of them. Okay, so what difference does that make? I mean, yes, absolutely phenomenal reality that the Son of God actually came. What does it tell you? What are the implications? Just start whatever comes to your mind in terms of implications, Greg. Okay, he brought his kingdom. He actually did that. Okay. The reality that God actually cares about the individual. He came for people, right? God actually came, and we see in his life continually, he actually cares about that person, and that person, and that person. Okay? Sorry, over here. God's incredible love. I mean, there's only one reason that Jesus came, and it's love. When you think, why else would the God of the universe, the one who created everything, why would he subject himself to becoming like one of us? And there's only one answer, and it's love. Okay, Yota? Yeah, the whole thing of he made atonement for us. Salvation was only possible. Book of Hebrews, all about this stuff. It's the only way that he could actually accomplish salvation for us is he became like one of us. Okay, what else? Karen? Yeah, very true. Very true. The whole thing of him being tempted like us, which really kind of blows me away. Like, really? Really? Like he was tempted with everything I get tempted with? Everything you get tempted with, he was tempted with? And that was part of his humanity. That was part of him becoming flesh and blood. And then Karen talked about a couple other things too. And in light of that, okay, he was like that, but also as a human, he demonstrated the Father. He demonstrated what he was like with his works and said, hey, we can do that too, empowered by the Spirit. He lived a life empowered by the Spirit. Very true. Any others? Sorry? He's knowable in a personal way. Very true. You know, I think that was a big part of his incarnation is, no, you can actually touch me. You can actually get to know me. You know, incredible. So I think you've mentioned the things that I put down. I'll just, the whole thing, we could see what God is like, and I'll talk about this a bit more. That's a biggie. This whole thing of, I'll touch on it some more. But Jesus saying, if you've seen me, you've actually seen the Father. You want to know what God's like? Look at Jesus. And I'll touch more on that. Can you imagine God, the one who created the universe we just talked about? And like I said, we could talk about all kinds of other aspects of creation. But he allowed himself to experience limitations, human limitations. And that's where I go, what Jack said. There's only one answer to why he would subject himself to that, and that's love. Everything. John 3:16, God loved the world so much that he sent his one and only Son. Verse 14 in our passage there, second part, he says, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father. If we look at Jesus, we see God's glory. We see God. A little while ago, I don't know what prompted me to do this, but I just felt to kind of just do a quick read through Peter's letters and John's letters from the perspective of, okay, hold on, here's these guys who hung out with Jesus for 3 years approximately, 24/7. They were with him the whole time. And I had this thought of, so how did they speak about him later? Because after a while, you get to know somebody and, oh, he's a great guy, but he's, everybody's got their weaknesses and everybody's got their stuff, right? And so how did they talk about Jesus after? They're the only guys that actually hung out with him and got to see what he's really like. I think of John Wimber. I have huge respect for him, obviously gone to be with the Lord a number of years ago. Those closest to him got to know some of those weaknesses as well. And I still remember hearing, not from her directly, but his wife Carol decided after the fact to write a book, and the title of her book was The Way It Was. Okay, this is her story about John. It's like, okay, you guys, I know you all really, wow, John Wimber, but I want you to also know the real story, right? Now, she's not disrespectful by any stretch. Okay, she had high regard for him and for everything God did through him. But I just find it interesting. The title of her book is The Way It Was. And you know what? John was one of those people who was totally honest about the way it was. And he would at different points stand in front of thousands of people and say things like, you know what? I'm just a fat man trying to go to heaven. That's just who I am. Okay? I remember him talking at one point about, I went to go, do this fast up in the mountain, and I lasted about, I forget what it was, 2 days, and I called my wife and said, I can't do this. I need a Big Mac. And so he came back down. So, I look at that, and yet John and Peter, about John here says, we saw his glory. I mean, if you want to just take time to do this once yourself, Peter, right at the beginning of his first letter, says, our Lord Jesus Christ. I mean, these guys, after spending 3 years with Jesus, they gave their lives for him. They were willing to die for him after he had already ascended up to heaven. To them, he was not someone that you got to know and then go, oh yeah, good old buddy Jesus, yeah, we hung out. And yeah, if you really knew him, that just wasn't there. To them, he was the Lord Jesus Christ. And John, when he's writing here, goes, you guys, this is who he was. Verse 18 says, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. No one's ever seen God, you guys, but we did. We saw him. We lived with him. We totally experienced what God is like. We saw him with flesh on. Like I already said, Jesus at one point says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so for myself, as I'm just reflecting on this stuff, what's really impacted me is to just have a fresh realization as I read through the Gospels. Whatever Jesus said, whatever he did, really is truth. I mean, this is God speaking. This isn't stuff we can just go, I'm not so sure I buy that. This is God speaking. Whatever he demonstrated is God speaking. And so when he talks about this whole thing of we saw his glory, glory means brightness, splendor, magnificence, beauty. We saw it. What do you think what's he talking about? We saw his glory. I mean, Jesus didn't walk around with a halo around his head, okay? Even so, though some pictures show that. He looked like a normal human being. But he says, we saw his glory. somebody's got really loud lungs up there. You know. Wow. So many aspects of God's glory. I see nobody's taking this whole thing of what did they see when they saw his glory. Various aspects of that. But let me just carry on with the passage because I think this is very interesting. I believe there's a correlation here between what Moses saw. Moses at one point said to God, he said, I want to see your glory. Show me your glory. And it's interesting because I have read that passage at different times, and I said, oh, that's interesting. He asked God to show him his glory, and God shows him something else. In my mind. But he doesn't. He shows him his glory. I don't know if that blows you away or not. So verse 18, Moses says, God, show me your glory. Verse 19, Exodus 33, and the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, Yahweh, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So Moses says, show me your glory, and God says, I'm going to show you my mercy. I'm going to show you my goodness. I'm going to show you my compassion. And John says here, we saw the glory of the Son who is full of grace and truth. I don't know if it hits you the same way or not, but to me it really does. Because when I think of glory, I think of Revelation. Okay, Book of Revelation. Like, wow! Any of you think that way? Like, oh man, like they must have seen like gold dust coming down all the time on Jesus or something, you know, or rainbows around him or, you know, all this stuff. And he says, we saw his glory. He's full of grace and truth. That was the glory. Okay? That's the glory of God. That's what God showed as his glory in the Old Testament to Moses. So I want to talk about that just for a bit here. So a summary of what Jesus revealed according to John here is this thing of grace and truth. And he says that 2 times in these verses. Verse 17, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now, certainly in the Old Testament, there was grace already. Okay? We all agree with that? I mean, and you think of the very first time that, even to do with the law, the very first time that Moses gets the 10 Commandments, okay? He's up on the mountain. God miraculously gives him these tablets, miraculously writes on these tablets the 10 Commandments. This is God speaking, God inscribed, okay, on stone, okay? We all know the story. God or Moses comes down the mountain, hears all the stuff going on in the camp. He goes, oh my goodness, sees this big calf that they've made. They're worshiping this calf. He's been up there for 40 days and 40 nights. He is so angry. He has just had an encounter with God where God speaks. The very first commands have to do with, don't have any other gods before me. And he is just furious. And he takes these tablets of stone and smashes them at the foot of the mountain. What does God do a few days later? Okay, Moses, chisel out some tablets of stone like those other ones I gave you. Come on back up. Let's do this again. Isn't that grace? Isn't that grace? David knew the grace of God. Talk about somebody who really sinned in the Old Testament. David knew the grace of God. So there was already grace in the Old Testament, but there is a difference. The law certainly was meant to show them how to live, but as Paul says, the primary thing the law did was it showed us our sin. Because the law didn't lift a finger to actually help us to live it out. There was no empowering in the law. The Bible speaks about us, actually, under the new covenant as no longer being under the law. Jesus brought grace. Jesus brought love, favor, forgiveness, but also an empowering to live his way. And so when John says in verse 16, out of his fullness we have all received grace in the place of grace already given. What he's saying is, you know what? There was grace over here in the Old Testament. But you know what? Jesus came along and he gave us grace in the place of that, even more grace. And so let me just talk about this thing about grace and truth for a little bit, because that's John's summary of Jesus' life as he brought grace and truth. So just a few things about grace. We see the grace of Jesus over and over again. If you think of grace as his favor, his forgiveness, his mercy, his kindness, we see him healing people continually. I think of, Jesus and his disciples going off to mourn John the Baptist's death after he was executed, and all of a sudden all these people show up. What does Jesus do? He pays attention to the crowd. He heals them, gives them what they need. That's grace. I think of the times that Jesus multiplied food for the thousands. Grace. When Jesus said he did not come to judge the world, but to save it. Grace. When Jesus hung out regularly with the tax collectors and so-called sinners, that's grace. You know what I really see grace in? How he kept responding to the religious leaders. Because I don't think I would have had that much grace. I think I would have said, get lost, you guys. You don't want this anyways. Like, get out of here. And he kept, over the years, the 3 years, he kept responding to them. He kept talking to them. He kept speaking truth to them. That's grace. Paul, after Jesus had already resurrected, or been raised from the dead and ascended to heaven, obviously one of the ones who he's the one who speaks the most about grace in the whole New Testament. And I think the reason Paul talks so much about the grace of God is because he's so aware of how much grace God showed him. I mean, he's on his way to arrest and kill Christians, and God says, okay, fair enough. About face. Appears to Paul, and Paul, I don't think really had a choice, to tell you the truth. I think God just came along and said, okay, enough. I'm going to use you now. Boing, That's grace. And so he writes about grace more than any other, because he realizes, wow, look at what, I deserved the opposite. He says, I'm the chief of sinners. But look at the grace that God showed me. And people were constantly drawn into and towards Jesus because they experienced grace from him. Now, the other thing that I find interesting, you know what? Grace and truth don't oppose each other. It's interesting to talk about grace and truth. We actually need both. And so let me say a few things about truth, and then I'll just tie them together a little bit. Jesus never hesitated to speak the truth, but it was in the context of grace. And here's the thing that blows me away. The sinners, the tax collectors, who were the ones who were most rejected in that society, they wanted to be around Jesus. And yet he's someone who spoke the truth. But why would they want to be around him constantly when he's actually speaking everything that God would say in that situation? Because it was always in the context of grace. And as Justin spoke about last week, this whole thing of the truth sets us free. Whatever God speaks does not bind us. Whatever God speaks is never a hindrance to life. It's actually the thing that brings life. It's actually the thing that brings freedom. just from what Justin spoke about there, John 8:31 and 32, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And Jesus didn't just bring truth, he said he is the whole truth. His whole life is truth. Now, in a day when people in our society are saying, we don't, basically saying there's no such thing as absolute truth. Truth is relative, right? It's true for you, but it's not true for me. If Jesus is the truth, then what he said, what he did is actually true for everybody. And if it's true, then it actually has infinite importance for everybody. And that's one thing that our whole society just doesn't want to embrace, is this thing of that there really is total, absolute truth. And Jesus' life, John says, a summary of his life is, you know what? He was grace and he was truth. And the two constantly were evident. One of the temptations I think we face in our day is we are tempted to go with grace and grace. And let's just be really nice to people. And Jesus was all about grace. But we're tempted to not speak the truth so much, because when you speak the truth, sometimes it's not really popular. And what will be labeled with at different points is, if we speak the truth, you guys don't have grace. And I'm not going to get into details here, but the whole area of sexuality in our day, for example, the whole thing of gay marriages, et cetera, we're tempted to, okay, let's compromise on the truth. Because as we state that we believe something in the truth, the backlash will be, you don't have grace. And I believe one of the things that God would call us to in this day, we have got to constantly hold the two together. We can't be people, we're going to declare the truth. And parts of the church have declared the truth, and they're to stand on the truth. And there's no love, there's no grace. There's got to be grace. There's got to be grace for people who are struggling. That's why the sinners and the tax collectors, they wanted to be around Jesus. And so we have got to constantly find ways to be full of grace and kindness and forgiveness and compassion and mercy for people, but speak the truth within the context of that. And I believe if we can be those kind of people, we're going to get the same things happening that Jesus did. People actually wanted to be around him. People actually want to be around us. And so as we take time over the next months, I guess, many months, to go through the book of John, my hope is that we'll just see over and over again, this is what God's like. And he actually wants to enable us to be those kind of people. He wants us to be the kind of people that others want to come to have life. And I think part of what God would want to do in us is for us just to take time to reflect on, what was Jesus really like? If grace and truth is a summary, wow, where do we see that all over in his life constantly? And that results in life. It brings life. And Jesus sometimes spoke some hard stuff. And our temptation can be to look at those things and go, We need to look at all those things and go, this is truth. Okay? Everything Jesus said, everything Jesus did is truth. Everything he said and did is a revelation of what God is like. And to get to know him more is to get to know God more. And so I just want to encourage us over the next while just let yourself take time to reflect, take time to meditate on this stuff. Let's have the worship team come up. And what we're going to do today, we're just going to end with, the ushers are going to they're going to pass out communion to us. And I want to encourage you, just receive it as you get it today, okay? But we've often said the receiving of communion is, it is in some way an eating and a drinking of Christ. It's receiving him. He said, "This is my body which is broken for you. This is my blood that's poured out for you." And so as we receive it today, just let this stuff kind of sink into you. And where God, for some of you, God really wants you to hear the thing today. You need to hear the grace of God for you. You need to just hear the grace. Some of you need to hear aspects of his truth today, where he just wants to speak specifically something to you that you know he's been saying. And so, as the worship team leads us, and ushers are going to pass out the communion, like I say, just receive it when it comes. And if at some point, if you want to stand up, sit down, whatever you want to do, let's just let this be a bit of a time of reflection, okay? Thank you, Father, as we already said. It was your great love that caused you to send your Son, Jesus Christ. No other motivation than just your great love. You loved the world so much that you gave your one and only Son. And I pray for a revelation for all of us. Just to see you more, to see what you're like more. Because we know that the more we see you, the more we become like you. And so, Lord, I pray this morning for whatever you would speak to us. Like I say, for some, we just need to hear aspects of your grace. For some of us, we need to hear aspects of your truth today. So we ask you to speak just as we receive, Lord Jesus, your body and your blood poured out for us. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. In some way, we want to just participate in you and want to receive you, want to say yes to you again today. Thank you, Lord.